Hello and welcome to this very special edition of CGTN, and we are broadcasting live in the southern Chinese city of Guangzhou. As China and the US are bogged down in a trade war, a documentary film has caught the attention on the Chinese social media. It's called Better Angels, directed by the one and only Malcolm Clarke, and two-time Oscar Prize winner. And so the film or the documentary focuses on the relations between China and the US, the world's two largest economies, through the lives of ordinary people. And today we have the luck and to have the pleasure to have him in the program. So welcome to the program, Mr. Clarke.
It's very nice to be here, thanks.
So before we get started, first tell us something about Better Angels, just in case some viewers didn't know about this film, because it hasn't been aired in China yet.
Better Angels will open in China on the 2nd of July. It's a film that has taken an enormously long time to make. We started in 2013, so it's been a 6-year journey, and not a very easy journey, I might say. We began by wanting to make a film about the future of the relationship, an optimistic film about the relationship between America and China. It was clear in 2013 that there were more and more difficulties coming to the surface between America and China in terms of trade, in terms of what the Americans felt was intellectual property theft, all kinds of tricky issues that needed negotiating. And what we wanted to do was to try and look past those kind of day-to-day concerns and try and advocate for a future in which America and China, as two superpowers, because China was becoming a superpower, that those two countries would get along, that they would find places where they could relate to each other, and they could also respect each other's differences where they existed. It took 3 years to make the film, and just as we were finishing the film, Donald Trump was elected and kind of threw everything that we had done into question, because his campaign to get elected targeted China very clearly and made it clear to all of us that the future was going to be a lot more complex and a lot more complicated. So we had to, after 3 years, we had to kind of start again and not make an entirely different film, but certainly question every one of the issues that we were discussing in the film. And that took much longer. So we finally have the film finished. It is, interestingly, it is not a political film. It's a political subject. The kind of dysfunctionality of the relationship between two superpowers. That is very political. What we decided to do was to tell that story in an anthropological way through the lives of ordinary Americans and ordinary Chinese people. So it's a little bit different, and it's a little bit more, perhaps, accessible to a wider, more general audience rather than an audience of experts.
So it is more accessible for everyone, people from all walks of life, right? And it took you about 6 years. So was it about the trade war between the United States and China from the very beginning? Because I watched the film yesterday, it was very subtly implied. So did you change the course of the storyline in the making of the film? We
changed the emphasis, but not the subject. I mean, we have one, it's very interesting actually, we have one gentleman in our film. He's actually one of the producers of our film. And we recorded an interview with him in 2015, which is 4 years ago now. And in that interview, he makes a very strong point that this is exactly the wrong time to be opening a trade war with China. And his logic is quite simple and quite smart. He says, by the year 2025, there will be 500 to 600 million middle-class people in China. Every one of those people is interested in America, wants to kind of buy American products, admires America on many levels. And so at exactly the moment when China is rising, when the economy is stronger, and when Chinese people are inclined to buy foreign products, why would we start a trade war? It was a very smart observation, and it was made way before anything happened. You know, and any of Trump's policies were implemented. So in a sense, I think we were a little bit ahead of the curve. We were a little bit more perceptive, perhaps, than some other people looking at this subject. But it would be wrong to say that we are, you know, we were all seeing and all knowing. I don't think anyone could have predicted, first of all, the election of Donald Trump, and second, what Donald Trump would do in terms of his provocations and his confrontations with China. That was wholly a new territory that we had to deal with in the film.
Yeah, given the fact that you started to make the film in 2013, it seems like the team is omniscient and you know what's going to happen, right? So did you pick the topic yourself?
No, the topic was, I'm not an expert in China and on China-America relations. I mean, I'm not Chinese, I'm not American, I'm a Brit, I'm from England. I have great admiration for both countries. I mean, I've lived in America for many, many years and worked in the United States. And the first time I came to China was in 1982, when I was a baby filmmaker, really. I mean, I was very, very young. So I've been fascinated by China for decades, but I'm not an expert. And I was asked to make the film, and actually I said no. I originally turned this job down because I felt...
no to the topic?
Yes, I said no because I did not think I had the qualifications to make a movie like this. As I say, I'm not an academic, I'm not an expert in China, I don't speak Mandarin. I accepted the job only after I found a very strong Chinese producer to work with me, who was an expert documentary filmmaker, award-winning filmmaker, who could guide me in China. But even then, you know, I made a big mistake, even after I accepted this job, because the one thing I did not understand, I thought I'd just be shooting in America and China. If you're making a film about China today, you cannot just shoot in China, because China today is a global power. And so it very quickly became clear that if I was going to do a good job and a responsible job of explaining China to a Western audience, we had to go to many, many other places. So we shot in Africa, we shot in the Middle East, we shot all over the world to really three-dimensionally show what China is today, because China is no longer the Middle Kingdom. China is a different country than it's ever been before. That, I think, is part of the anxiety of people in the West. They see China becoming a global power, and they're nervous about that. So I wanted to try and explain to a Western audience, most particularly to an American audience, what China was doing, how it was doing it, and most importantly, I wanted to show Americans that ordinary Chinese people are far more similar to Americans than they are different. Chinese people work hard. They have a strong relationship to family. They, I think, like Americans, they want what Americans want. They want to live peacefully. They want to have 3 meals a day. They want the future to be better for their kids than for the lives that they have led. That's the American dream. And that's interestingly, it's also the China dream. And I think most Americans did not understand that and still do not. I think China has a lot of work to do in really explaining what is happening in this country, because it's extraordinary what's happening. But people in the West, I think, are a little bit afraid.
And do you think China is doing a good job in explaining itself to the West, to the Western world?
I'm always loath to kind of outright criticize, because I know that there are many challenges here in China, but I do feel that the Chinese government and the Chinese media system and filmmakers and documentary filmmakers and journalists could do a much better job.
Yeah, how, in what way do you think that these groups of people could do a better job?
Let me give you a simple example. America has been telling the story of America, in a sense the mythic America, this extraordinary thing that we all think we know. They've been telling that story for 100 years, through Hollywood, through television, through journalism, through literature, through pop songs and popular culture. America is an expert at telling its own story, if you will, through, let's call it soft propaganda. And it's a tribute to America that it doesn't matter where you are on planet Earth. You can be in Fiji, you can be in Argentina, you can be in Siberia. Everybody thinks they understand a little bit about America, because America does a great job of telling its own story. China in the last 40 years has changed out of all recognition. When I first came here in 1982, China was a very different country, a very rural country and a very poor country. Now, as someone in my film said, you come to China to see the future. And I think that's something that the Chinese people can be extraordinarily proud of. China has so much to be proud of, and yet, whenever it tries to tell its story to people in the West, they do it through propaganda. And propaganda is something which will never be swallowed in the West. We know that it's propaganda. We know that it's kind of like a cheerleading, glossy presentation of the facts. And so we resist that. And I think that the Chinese government could do a far better job of telling the world what has happened in this country and how extraordinary this change has been. Because by any historical measure, what has happened in this country in the last 40 years has never happened in any country ever in the history of the world. If you look at America, it took America 200 years to get to where it is today. It's taken China 40 years. And we have extraordinary cities, we have extraordinary infrastructure. You have 99% literacy. You have amazing steps being taken in terms of poverty alleviation in this country. There's so much to be proud of, and there's so much that I think people would be interested to know and learn about China. And yet, there is still fear and suspicion about China. That is the reason that we made.
Yeah, there was suspicion and fear, right, from other countries towards China. Where do you think the fear comes from in the first place?
Well, I think in America we have a country that has been telling itself for 200 years that America is exceptional, and in many ways America is exceptional. But I think this kind of philosophy of exceptionalism, that America is the special country, the shining city on the hill, the country that we should all look towards and try to emulate. I think that's dangerous. I think it is an amazing place. But so is Germany, and so is France, and so are many other countries in the world. And I don't think that telling a populace, an entire nation, that you are special and everyone else is not special, I don't think that's healthy. And I think that the rhetoric of the American dream can actually be quite toxic, because when you think that you are special, and 8,000 miles away there's this country which is undergoing this extraordinary renaissance, that inevitably starts to breed suspicion and fear, because for so long now, since the fall of the Soviet Union, it has been a unipolar, a unilateral world. America has been in charge. Suddenly, China has a growing economy, 70% the size of the United States, and predicted to overtake. It has a growing military. It has extraordinary advances in technology. Naturally, America is going to look at this and say, where do we fit in? We used to be number one. Now suddenly there are two kind of co-equals. I actually think this is very good for America. I think the world can benefit from having two superpowers, which can act as a kind of corrective mechanism between the two of them. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, if they can learn to work together and respect each other's differences, I think the world will be a better place, and I think America and China will be a better place.
So you think the world should have two powers, economically speaking, right? And then, so you're trying to use this film to influence the opinions probably from America?
No, I think what I'm trying to do, I think what we all tried to do in this film, is acknowledge the fact that there is an information deficit between the United States and China. I could be wrong about this, but my sense of it after 6 years of making a film on this subject is that the Chinese people understand America far better than Americans understand China. That goes back to what I said a little bit earlier, that Americans are very good at telling their own story, and China has been listening. China sees what happens in America. The Chinese people understand the American political system. They understand what America is, what it feels, what its philosophy is, what its way of life is. Americans know almost nothing, with the exception of the kind of, the literati, the intelligentsia, the people who are invested in knowing about China, but the ordinary American people on the street know very little about China. In fact, I would go as far as to say that I don't think they could point to Beijing on a map. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's a problem. I think we always, inevitably, it's a human quality to be a little bit fearful of things we don't understand. And if China is not understood, then there's room for doubt, there's room for anxiety, there's room for fear. So what I wanted to do with this film, not exclusively, because it was made very much to be seen both in China and America, but I did want to address that information deficit as it exists for Americans. I wanted to show Americans that the Chinese people, that ordinary people, not politicians, not kind of super rich people, but just ordinary Chinese, had very much the same values and the same beliefs and the same desires for themselves and for their families as Americans. That, as I said earlier, you look at the China dream and the American dream, they're not so dissimilar. They're more similar than they are different. And I think when Americans see that, there's a sense of relief and a sense of a kind of letting go of anxiety. We've shown this film extensively in preview in the United States. It will open in America later this year, but in preview we've shown it all across the States. And the reception has been twofold. From the journalist community, they have been skeptical, and they have been critical, because they say, well, what about IP theft, and what about job stealing, and what? So they go back to these 4 or 5 obsessions that the American press have. But putting aside the press for a second, you show this film to ordinary people, and there's a huge sense of relief and delight, mm-hmm. that they feel emotionally that they can understand Chinese people and Chinese dilemmas and Chinese anxieties and Chinese hopes and fears. And the moment you can put a human face on anyone, the moment you can look into someone's eyes and you can have an emotional reaction, then the whole situation changes, the whole dynamic changes. And what we have found, even in the middle of America, in Iowa, which is Trump country, yeah. We show them this film and they love it. And they're relieved and they're happy, and they say, we had no idea about who the Chinese were and what the Chinese were. And so I think every film should be a weapon. Every film should try and create a reaction, provoke a reaction. And what we wanted to do was this. We wanted to provoke the reaction that we should be more accepting of China, and we should be less suspicious of China. And this is not to let China off the hook. China's made some big mistakes. I think we can all acknowledge that. I don't know a country that doesn't make big mistakes. That's right. I mean, it's not, it doesn't matter. With my country, England is making a big mistake right now. I'm embarrassed by what's happening in Brexit. But this is in the nature of things. It's in the nature of politics and the nature of evolution of nations. And so China, I think, has to put its own house in order, and I think it is doing. And I think, but I think a lot of the charges against China, frankly, are illegitimate. And I think that's something that we have tried to address a little bit in our film. We look at the issue of, for example, job theft. And we say, American jobs have been shipped to China. Well, China didn't come and steal those jobs. Those jobs were shipped by American manufacturers who wanted to make more profit and frankly didn't really care too much about their own workforce. So they put people out of work and shipped jobs to China.
Yeah, I totally agree that you said every film should be a weapon, right? But from my understanding, I watched the film yesterday, and then it seems like you are trying to narrate the story from the perspective of Chinese. And do you think the American community would buy it?
I think they have bought it. I think there's the big criticism we get in this film is for the things that we have not done in the film. And the things that I did not do in the film, I did not do consciously. I did not make a film about human rights issues in China. I did not make a film about intellectual property theft. I did not make a film particularly about what is called currency manipulation. These are obsessions of the American body politic to some extent and the American press. I don't think these are illegitimate issues. I don't think they should not be addressed. But I didn't want to do what every other expert on China, every other network, every other newspaper has already done. What I wanted to do was make a different film, a new film, look at different issues. And the issues that we were dealing with, I think we've dealt with fairly well, in that when Americans look at this thing, they don't think about IP theft, and they don't think about job stealing. They think about the Chinese people and how much they can identify with the Chinese people. That was what we tried to do in this film.
So who is your target audience in America?
I think my target audience are the people who voted for Trump. Those are the people who are most against China, without really knowing anything about China. I don't mind people being against China if they are informed. If they truly think that that's something, after they know about China, if they say, I still feel China is a bad place, there's nothing I can do about that. But I think the most important thing that we have to do is, as journalists, as filmmakers, we have to tell the truth. We have to allow people to make up their own minds, not to manipulate them into thinking this way or that way. And I think we have to respect that that people need to be given a better story and a fuller story and a fuller picture, so that they can at least make up their minds responsibly for themselves. I feel that the American electorate was manipulated by President Trump's campaign. I feel that that China was used as a bogeyman. I think China has been used for years and years as a whipping boy by American politicians who are opportunistic. And the reason it's easy to use China as a bogeyman is because China doesn't defend itself well. And I think that's beginning to change. I mean, I think the existence of CGTN, for example, the fact that you're looking at portraying China to the world is very, very important. But that hasn't been the case for the last 20 years. That's a relatively recent development. China has so much to be proud of. I don't think it needs to propagandize its achievements. I think if it tells the world what it has achieved and how much has been achieved on the sacrifice of ordinary Chinese people, because this hasn't happened by accident. It's happened because millions of people have worked extremely hard to create a better life for the people of China. And I think that's something which all Americans and all Europeans can respect. And that story needs to be told better. And I think if you could do that, I think the world could be a less threatening and more peaceful place.
And do you think most Americans or probably Europeans are vastly informed about China?
I think Europeans, I don't know whether Europeans are better informed, but Europeans are more respectful and accepting of the renaissance of China. I mean, they call it the rise of China. It's interesting. I think a more accurate term is renaissance, which Americans maybe understand a little bit less than Europeans. It is a European word, actually. But for 2,000 years, actually maybe longer, China was the largest economy on the planet, and it was a huge technological engine. When we think of all the things that China has invented and contributed to the world, this is clearly a renaissance. There were a couple of hundred years, the colonial era, when China was really stopped in its tracks. The evolution was stopped. But now I think China is coming back to gain its kind of rightful place in the world. I don't think China wants to be number one. Not that there's any reason that it shouldn't be number one, but I think China, just wants to join the community of nations and be respected by the rest of the world. I think that respect has to be earned. Mm-hmm. And the way China can earn that respect is just by telling its own story better.
Mm-hmm. So I'm quoting you now. You once said it's challenging to make films in China. So can you tell me what difficulties you met in the making of this film?
One of the biggest difficulties of making films in China is as an Englishman who speaks no Mandarin, interviewing Chinese people. The Chinese have a very different kind of personal philosophy of talking about themselves and opening up certainly to foreigners. One of the great difficulties I have anywhere in the world is, people have to trust you, to talk to you and tell you the truth about themselves. And sometimes we're asking people to talk about intimate things, their marriages, their relationships with their kids. People aren't going to do that if they don't trust you. It's much more difficult for a Westerner to talk to a Chinese person and earn that trust, because there are the cultural barriers. Chinese people tend to be more closed, a little bit less extrovert, if you will. Plus there's the language problems. What's one of the reasons I insisted in making this film on having a very strong, very empathetic, professional Chinese producer who could effectively speak for me. And together, our team, but specifically my producer, helped me to gain the trust of people that I wanted to speak to in China. It was a bit of a challenge, but I enjoyed it, and I think most of the people in our film really did open up themselves, and they were very generous with their personal stories and their personal histories. So that's one of the strengths of the film, that everybody in the film is, I think, emotionally honest and emotionally accessible.
Mm-hmm. So it's only about language, anything else? Mainly
about language. I mean, we didn't have any, I remember when I came in 1982, it was a very different country, and people were very suspicious of a Western filmmaker. Everything that I had to, wanted to see, I had to ask specific permission. I had to get a signed paper and have people follow me around. It was much more difficult. China's a much more open society than certainly back in the 80s. we never encountered any great difficulties. We did go through the kind of process of showing the film to the Chinese authorities to make sure that it was something that they accepted. But again, you know, there was never a point where I said, "Oh, they're telling me to take this out or change this. I cannot, you know, live with this. This is." They were, I think, you know, we were trusted by them. It took a while because they wondered what we were doing, but we were never in an argument with them about control or about editorial policy. This film was entirely funded by Americans. It was entirely editorially controlled by my producer, William Mundell, and myself. We never took a penny of Chinese money, and we never took any Chinese editorial control. This is an independent film. If it's a bad movie, it's my fault. But if it's a good movie, it's because we attempted to tell the truth about China to the rest of the world. And I hope that this is the beginning. I mean, it's only a small kind of speck of sand in a huge kind of landscape. But I hope it's a beginning of China understanding that a more open policy with regard to telling Chinese stories can have huge returns and be very beneficial to what's happening in China.
So it is only the beginning, right? So do you have
for me,
other
it's
projects in China?
Yes, for me it's a beginning. I kind of, I mean, I've made films all over the world. I've shot in over 80 countries. This is a country which indisputably for the next century, for the 21st century, the renaissance of China is the biggest news story. It will continue to be the big story for at least another 50, 60 years. What's happening here is historic. And I think for someone like me, because all I really am interested in is making interesting movies and telling great stories and finding an audience for those stories, there's so much to see and there's so much to understand. And I don't really understand China still. I understand better than 6 years ago, but I'm by no means an expert. But I do feel, in a sense, as someone who really doesn't understand China, if I'm interested in something, the likelihood is, because I'm a Westerner, if I'm interested, then people in the West will be interested. So in a sense, I'm kind of channeling my lack of expertise and saying, oh, that story, that might be interesting to people because I like it. I think it's interesting. So we're going to do many more films, I think, in China and about China. I think it's important. It's very important, not just for China, but I think the world needs to understand this country better and respect it more.
And you kept saying you're not an expert on Chinese issues, but I watched the film yesterday and it was like the story was well told, and then all of the stories and the people and plots actually were really good. And then did you receive any criticism from the West?
No, not about, no, I mean, the thing is, I'm not an expert on China, but I am an expert filmmaker. So I can make a film, I can tell a story, if the raw material is strong. And in this film, the raw material is marvelous. We have I'm sorry, this has to stop. That's an alarm on my phone. The point about China is that we know so little, and so if we can tell these stories in an entertaining and emotional way, then I think we have the opportunity to maybe build a business around explaining China to the world. And I don't just mean in documentary films, I also mean in drama and feature films, because if I have one criticism of what I do, it's that documentary films only reach a niche audience. If you can tell a Chinese story through a theatrical feature film, I think I can reach a far wider audience. And so that's our intention in the future, to make documentary films for sure, but also to tell Chinese stories through drama again, so that we can reach an audience in the West.
So you're going to have some other projects on China in the future?
I'm going to have a lot of projects about China in the future. For the next 5 years, I see this as my goal, to try and break down some barriers and bring the two countries closer together. I mean, it's a personal interest. It's kind of a little journey that I fell into. It was an accident. I said yes to one movie, but having said yes to Better Angels, I now see that a path is opening up where I can perhaps make some more interesting movies and also find a wider and more receptive audience.
So I was going through the comments on Facebook and Weibo, and many people are wondering, Better Angels. So tell us why it is called Better Angels. What does it say?
Better Angels is a term, are two words that were coined by Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States.
When the Civil War ended.
The Civil War ended, and Lincoln said to the people from the South and the people from the North, if we are going to heal this country, if we're going to bring the two sides and make it one country which is complete, then people on both sides have to bury their animosities, bury their anxieties, and find the better angels of their natures. In other words, to find the good side of themselves and their emotions, and have a generosity of spirit towards people who, until then, were their enemies. And only if both sides can come together and forgive and accept, including accepting differences, then perhaps America can be a stronger and better country. And indeed, he was correct. That's what happened. And America has, they call it the United States. It is a united country. And we decided that this term was a perfect analogy for what we wanted to see between China and America. Let's respect each other's differences, as James Baker said in our movie. Let's work together where we can, and where we feel we can't, let's at least be respectful of having different points of view. Let's not make it that if it's not my way, there's no way. There's a way, I think, of China and America unifying on some of the huge important issues that need to be addressed in the world, like climate control, for example. If we can appeal to the better angels of our nature, I think China and America can make a better world, not only for their own people, but for the people all over the world.
Yeah, but it was back in the 1860s, right, when it was said the Better Angels by Abraham Lincoln. Do you think in this day and time it could help Americans recall what happened in the past and soften their opinions on China, or probably change their whole status quo at this moment?
You know, when we showed this film to Republicans in the heartland, there was an open-mindedness. The one thing that's interesting about Americans, I mean, I really don't feel that Americans hate China. I think Americans, the electorate, have been manipulated by politicians, and I do feel that when people see this film, they have an open-mindedness and a receptivity to learning more about China, and to not judging China without really any kind of any real information. I mean, remember one thing in this film, you know, Americans say, oh, the Chinese stole our jobs. Well, I don't think they did. But what's very interesting, because of globalization, and we show this in the film, jobs came to China because it was less expensive to manufacture in China. But now Chinese workers are being put out of work because jobs are being taken from China to Africa, where it's even cheaper to manufacture products. Globalization is entirely agnostic with respect to its victims. Globalization will simply find the cheapest place to make something, and they'll go and make it. It doesn't matter where the jobs have been taken from, who's losing a job. The lowest unit price will always win in a globalized world. And when Americans see that, when they see that, you know, jobs that they thought were sent to China are no longer in China because they're now in Ethiopia, They understand that the issue is not China. The issue is globalization and how fair it is, how it has impact not just on their country, but even another strong economy like China. So these are issues that I think when people understand that, they reduce their enmity towards China. They reduce their resentment of China. They realize that China is living through the same kind of evolutions that America has already lived in. And I think the more we can understand that we're more similar than we are different, I think that's a powerful message to give to Americans and also to Chinese people, but particularly Americans, because they know less about this country than they really deserve to know.
But they have realized that the problem is not China, but it's about globalization, right? So many of the jobs have ended up in Ethiopia or probably Southeast Asia right now.
Exactly.
But China is promoting globalization right now, but America is trying to reverse it somehow.
Correct.
So do you think they are actually fighting against each other?
I think what President Trump is doing right now by putting up barriers and putting up tariffs is ill-advised. This is my personal view. I mean, I have no standing. I'm a filmmaker. I'm not a politician, and I'm not a policymaker. But my personal view is that when you have 600 American companies going to Washington, as they did a few days ago, and registering their dismay at Trump's tariff policy because it was damaging their businesses and damaging their workers and damaging their bottom lines, then there's something wrong. And I sometimes think that if the presidency changes, and we don't know whether that will happen or not, but I think once the White House has a different incumbent, I think the relationship between America and China can be normalized. I don't think it'll ever go back to the way it was before, and that's probably a good thing for both America and China. But I do feel that the relationship is going to be more comfortable and more balanced once this particular administration has left the stage.
Okay, so thank you very much. Those are the questions I wanted to ask, and I was going through all of the questions online. I think I've got lots of comments on Facebook, and the film will be aired on the 2nd July.
July the 2nd, all over China.
All over China, right? I think this is Lucy Branson said July the 2nd is my birthday, and I'm looking forward to that.
Well, tell Lucy we look forward to seeing her wherever she is. It would be good if she could also tell her friends. Maybe she can take the whole birthday party and see the movie.
That's right. And we have Dennis. Nice picture, by the way, powerful message, and thank you very much. And I've got a lot more other messages, and someone is saying, as Dennis, saying the tariffs don't hurt China much. US people are paying the price. And do you agree?
Yes, I do. I do.
So
I mean, this economy, the Chinese economy is very robust. It's very strong. America's been doing much better, but what is happening is clear that this kind of march of corporate bosses flying into and driving into and getting railroad trains into Washington, D.C. to complain to their representatives and to give testimony at a congressional committee about the fact that their businesses are being hurt by these tariffs. I think that says an awful lot about who is being damaged and who is not. And I think it's not in America's interest.
No,
frankly.
Definitely. So we have John Doe, who is saying Trump is old guard, but will never get well-paying manufacturing jobs back in the US. Is that true? According to your understanding, because you're not a politician, but...
it's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I don't think the old American kind of East Coast factory jobs are coming back anytime soon. But we should not underestimate the robustness of the American economy and American innovation. It's still extraordinary. They may not be making kind of air conditioners in Ohio, but maybe they'll be making Teslas in California, I don't think the jobs are necessary. I think the jobs are going to change. I think Americans are still going to want to manufacture more. There's a huge amount of pressure, and it's not just from Trump, for all kinds of companies like Apple to make more of their product back in the States. I think jobs, the kind of day-to-day appliance jobs, refrigerators, televisions, air conditioners, those things are gone. I don't think they're coming back. But never underestimate America. It's an extraordinary place, highly innovative and very, very responsive to change. So when they see that something is not going well, they are very quick to come up with a solution and a correction. That's why I think we all admire America. It is a very vital country and will continue to be so.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so for those who just tuned in, this is CGTN, and we're broadcasting live in the southern Chinese city of Guangzhou, and we were interviewing Malcolm Clarke, the one and only Malcolm Clarke, two-time Oscar Prize winner, of course, Best Angels, and it's going to be aired on the 2nd July. Of course, go to the film definitely, right?
Thank you.
So what would you like to say to the viewers and to the possible audience?
What I want to say, I think, is we worked very hard on this film. I don't think we have all the answers. I would like to hear from people after they've seen the film. We've tried to be respectful, both to the United States and to China. I am a great admirer of both countries. I'd like to have feedback because we are going to make more films, and we are making more films about China and China's relationship with the world. So perhaps, if anyone has any good ideas or any feedback, I'd be honored to receive it.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Clarke.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks so
a lot.
much. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to have you here.
Thanks.
Thank you.